Church Missouri Synod was founded essentially for two reasons. First, the founders wanted to create a doctrinally sound, confessional Lutheran church in America. Second, they were convinced that whether by training pastors and teachers, or by producing worship materials such as hymnals and Bible studies, or by doing joint mission work, the congregations would be able to do the work of the Lord far better together than any one of them could do it alone. As a matter of fact, the word synod means a walking together. The first major challenge to the new denomination was the great immigration of Germans to the United States. Between 1840 and 1870, nearly 2 million Germans came to America. Most came because of the economic opportunities, not because of the religious oppression that drove earlier immigrants. The leaders of the Missouri Synod were determined to meet as many immigrants as possible, to help them get settled, and to encourage them to embrace the confessional faith of their forefathers in their new land. Immigrant missions were carried out in seaport cities such as New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where F.C.P. Winnikin served between 1845 and 1850. The first immigrant missioner called to New York was Stephanus Kyle, the son-in-law of C.F.W. Walther. He served 36 years.
And he made it his responsibility to greet Germans as they got off the boat and to find out who were the German Lutherans, to give them advice as to what part of the country they could settle, to recommend them to pastors in those areas, to help get them started here as American immigrants, but also as German Lutherans. So it was almost more the individual pastor throughout the country who did this kind of work of helping to locate and organize and encourage German Lutherans to start Lutheran congregations.
Immigrants already settled in the U.S. were a concern too. At the first synodical meeting, a mission board was established. The board called Pastor Carl Fricke to be missionary at large with instructions to find Lutheran settlements in Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Ohio. In 1852, Gustav Pfau was appointed colporteur. He was to locate Lutherans living on the frontier, sell religious books, Bibles, hymnals, catechisms, and devotional materials, and provide advice about how they could start a congregation and call a pastor. By the turn of the century, the great flux of immigration was over, and the Missouri Synod had nearly 700,000 members, 2,000 churches, 1,500 pastors, and was organized into 14 districts. It seemed that the new Synod had made the most of its meager resources as it attempted to serve immigrant Germans. But despite the growth, there were controversies. For instance, the great supporter of the early work of the church, Wilhelm Lehe, had grave misgivings about the constitution of the new Synod. He did not like it that the congregations of the Synod called their own pastors. Without central authority, he feared mob rule. It was a fear born in part by living through times of unrest and rebellion in Germany. Walther defended the Constitution. The Synod should be an advisory body. The ministry should grow out of the local congregations.
One of the, I think, really tragic events in the early history of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was the break between Lehe and the Missouri Synod, or to personalize it, between the great theologian Lehe and the great theologian Walther. Walther understood the pastor of a congregation as preaching and teaching in the name of the congregation that had called him. God called pastors through congregations. Moreover, privately, every Christian was to be sharing the gospel with those around him. But the pastor did it publicly in the name of the congregation and with a direct commission of God through the congregation. Now, Lehe's understanding was a little different. He believed that pastors exercised an authority that God had originally given to the church, but that didn't necessarily come to the pastor through a congregation, but rather it came to the pastor from one generation down to the next, especially from the clergy, so that the ministry, in a sense, was a self-perpetuating office within the church.
Walther and Winnikin went to Bavaria to see Lehe work out their differences. While the meetings were friendly, the disagreement was not resolved. and Leah withdrew his support. While in Germany, Wyneken met with Pastor Friedrich August Brunn, who agreed to carry on. Brunn opened a preparatory school for pastors in state. By 1878, he had sent 235 future pastors to the Missouri Synod. Relations with other Lutherans in the U.S. were not always friendly. In 1845, the Buffalo Synod was formed by Lutherans who had emigrated from Prussia under the leadership of Johann A.A. Grabau. After initial hopes that these Prussians would join the Saxons and laymen in the Missouri Synod, doctrinal differences arose. Grabau insisted on clergy supremacy and centralized church government. This reminded many Saxon members of the Missouri Synod of the authoritarian practices of their banished bishop, Martin Stephan. They discussed these differences often in early Missouri Synod conventions. Bitterness grew, and Grabau excommunicated the entire Missouri Synod, 200 congregations strong, in 1859. After Grabau was forced from the presidency in 1866, the Buffalo Synod split. 11 congregations joined the Missouri Synod. The Synod was little more than a decade old when the Civil War broke out. Many German Lutherans fought on the Union side. There were regiments of Germans formed in Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Walther addressed important issues in the pages of Der Lutheraner. He strongly condemned as sinful many of the evils associated with slavery, while pointing out that slavery itself was not called a sin in the Bible. He also denounced the fanatical zeal of some abolitionists and counseled German immigrants to exercise good citizenship during the conflict. The spiritual care of Lutherans remained a prime concern. For instance, Wyneken, who served as president of the Synod during the Civil War, traveled across battle lines to minister to congregations in the South. Pastor Frederick W. Richmond became the first Missouri Synod pastor to serve as a chaplain. Appointed by General Grant, Richmond served Union soldiers in both the German and English languages. His diary reflected the hardships of military chaplaincy to the Union troops.
We were compelled to camp without tents, day and night, on the bare ground under God's free heaven. As a result of these hardships, the number of our sick increased alarmingly, so that we had to abandon them by the wayside just to transport the hopeful cases.
When they first came to the United States, the laymen and Saxons found that many Lutheran groups had lost touch with their confessional heritage. Rightly or wrongly, they believed that the use of the English language was responsible. Therefore, in their constitution, they stipulated that German language be used in worship and important meetings. Yet Walther and other leaders saw the importance of communicating confessional theology to English-speaking people. While the Synod Convention declined to form an English mission district, Walther supported English-speaking Lutherans when they founded an English Synod. The Lutheran Witness was the official newspaper of the English Synod. It presented the views of the Missouri Synod to English-speaking Americans. In 1911, the English Synod was accepted into the Missouri Synod and became the non-geographical English district. The Lutheran Witness became the Synod's official English language publication. The Americanization of the Missouri Synod had begun. During its first half-century, the Synod was served by three very remarkable presidents: C.F.W. Walther, F.C.D. Wyneken, and Heinrich Christian Schwann. Walther, the first president of the Missouri Synod, volunteered as the first president of the Evangelical Lutheran Synodical Conference, an organization that encouraged cooperation between church bodies, such as the Missouri, Wisconsin, Ohio, Illinois, Minnesota, and Norwegian synods. Known as the American Lutheran, Walther was an accomplished theologian, administrator, musician, pastor, and teacher. Wyneken was a tireless synodical president. He served 14 years. One of the president's key responsibilities was to visit congregations and their schools. In a growing church, that meant as many as 60 visits a year. These were working visits. He would preach, teach, encourage the pastors and lay members, and yes, settle disputes. And the Synod presidency was just a part-time position. He was the full-time pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church, where Walther had served before him in St. Louis. The first full-time president was Pastor Heinrich Christian Schwann, Wyneken's nephew and a former missionary to Brazil. He came to the U.S. and served congregations in Missouri and Cleveland, Ohio, where he popularized the Christmas tree. He is often remembered as the author of The Explanation to Luther's Small Catechism that was published by the Synod in 1896. Schwann was president for 21 years. Another chapter in the continuing Americanization of the Lutheran Church was about to be written. In 1917, the United States entered World War I, a European war that had been boiling for 3 years. As a member of an alliance that included England, France, Italy, and Russia, the U.S. was opposed by powers led by Germany, the native homeland of many Missouri Synod members. As the American commitment in World War I grew, anything German became suspect. And to English-speaking Americans, that included German-speaking neighbors. No matter how loyal, German-speaking people were subject to discrimination, threats, and the harassment of vigilante groups. They would try to prove their loyalty by purchasing more war bonds than their neighbors and submitting to the scrutiny and questions of federal agents.
In April of 1917, the pastor of the congregation in which I was baptized, St. Paul's Fort Dodge, Iowa, wanted to remind his people that they were now in America. Some of them were citizens, some were not. But they now owed their allegiance to Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. He preached, of course, in German, and he preached on the natural text, render unto Caesar the things that were Caesar's. In German, that text reads, Gib dem Kaiser, was des Kaisers ist. The spy from the Webster County Sheriff's Department didn't understand much German, but he understood the word Kaiser. And Pastor Bunderall was arrested and taken to Des Moines and held in jail about 10 days before the authorities could be made to understand that he was insisting that his people be loyal to the United States and not to Kaiser Wilhelm.
Despite the problems, members of the Missouri Synod responded to the nation's need loyally and eagerly. More than 37,000 Missouri Synod men and women members served in the armed forces of the U.S. Military chaplains of the Missouri Synod served with distinction, some receiving commendations for valor, all being recommended for promotion. But World War I was a watershed for the Missouri Synod. After the war, the Synod would move to accept English as its primary language. Its sons and daughters would be born and raised as English-speaking U.S. citizens. And in time, its face would change. But the commitment that brought the Synod together nearly 70 years before would not change. Missouri's commitment to the scriptural gospel, to the Lutheran confessions, to the faith of its fathers would sound a little different, look a little different, maybe even act a little different. But it would remain as strong and ready as ever to pursue vigorously its mission and ministry in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you that you continue to gather amongst your people wherever two or three call on your name. We ask you to be present now and continue to guide and lead our discussion so that this would be a time of profitable growth, both intellectually and also spiritually. Be with us now for Jesus' sake. Amen. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is this one here. It looks like this. They both say organization to World War I, I think, but we'll start with the one that came with the movie. All right, the Synod is founded to create a doctrinally sound confessional Lutheran church in America, to train pastors and teachers, to provide worship materials, hymnals, Bible studies, and to conduct missionary work. Among others, a great challenge was the influx of German immigrants to the United States in the late 19th century. The Synod rose despite controversies with other Lutherans and turbulent times in American history. German Lutherans experienced discrimination brought on by World War I. Okay, question one. How did the Synod carry out its goals? Anybody catch this from the video? a united synod. One of the things that was mentioned in the video was still back in Germany, there were people who were training pastors and sending them to America. I'm guessing that probably had something to do with the synod being able to carry out its goals. Can you think of any others? Okay, question 2. Discuss, which means you guys have to talk here a little bit, some of the ways the synod was able to help immigrating Lutherans get settled in their new homeland.
Well, that pastor that was by the boat, I mean, they come off the boat and I'm like, well, that's a great idea.
Yep.
Told them, you know, where to go and where to settle and.
Yeah, it was very helpful. Any other ways that you could think of or that you heard? Well, what was the official language of the synod?
German.
German. That had to help too. Okay, anything else? I mean, this is supposed to be a discussion. Even though I think I've got the shyest congregation in the whole synod.
During that part, I forget who it was or what, but it said somebody would sell religious books and give advice on how to start congregations.
Anybody remember who that was? I want to say it was Winnigan, but that doesn't sound right. I think it was somebody else. Well, we might get back to that later. Question 3, what divided C.F.W. Walther and Leah? Doctrine. Yeah, does anybody remember what specific doctrine was at issue?
What constituted a church?
Maybe at one point, but on this video, that wasn't the issue that they talked about.
How pastors were called?
Yeah. To whom are pastors able to exercise their authority? C.F.W. Walther said, what did he say?
Your congregation.
Yeah, the pastor's authority comes through the congregation, and he serves publicly on their behalf. According to Leah, where did the pastor's authority come from?
Synod, or the,
Well, maybe. I guess I was thinking of a different answer, it doesn't make them right. Maybe through synod. I mean, he did believe in a centralized government. I was going to say God, but I think you're probably right. Through the synod. Yeah, so a pastor's allegiance for Leah was not to his congregation, but to, well, God, but then what did Randy say? The synod. So doctrinally, that doesn't sound like it's a really big deal. But as we've talked about before, every bit of doctrine is important to us. As Missouri Synod Lutherans, as Buffalo Synod Lutherans, as Wisconsin Synod Lutherans, doctrine is really, really important. So to say, well, why can't you just compromise? Because we can't. Doctrine's too important to us. We can't compromise on any of the doctrines from Scripture. Are we able to compromise on some doctrines? Yes. What are those doctrines called? I may have said this before. Adiaphora. Yes, there are some things that each congregation can decide for themselves, and no one else in the synod can tell them what to do. What would be some examples of adiaphora?
Whether we meet at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock.
Okay, the time of meetings, or whether to have them at all. What else?
You said last week, I think, how many elders or?
Yeah, how many elders the church has? I think you gotta have some, but how many is really up to that congregation. What about something as simple as the carpet in your various rooms?
Yeah.
Sure, each congregation can choose their own, there's no right answer. How about the way that you light the candles or put them out? Does it matter? No. I don't know if the previous pastor made a big deal of it, but I still have kids going, what do I do? You light the candles, well, where do I start? Wherever you want, it doesn't matter. It's not doctrinal.
That's your trainer that does that. He says you certain order and you
You know,
reverse.
and he probably does, but they still don't do it all the same, which is okay with me. Here's a question for you. What about what the pastor wears during worship? Is that adiaphora, or is that some sort of doctrinal thing? It is adiaphora. Do you think every pastor in the synod agrees with that?
No.
Probably not. No. And I know that it's adiaphora, but that doesn't mean that I'm happy when I go and see some pastor wearing jeans and a polo shirt and maybe a jacket over that. That irritates the heck out of me. But he has the right to do it. Where the altar is placed, is that doctrine? Is that adiaphora? It's adiaphora. When I first arrived here, does anybody remember where the altar was?
In the center.
Well, it was center, but where else was it?
Front.
Yeah, it was out front. And Pastor McManus would go behind it, I assume, in order to do all of his things. I don't know if he's taller than me or not, but I tried that out, and I couldn't see over the altar. I thought, well, maybe I can get a box or something. I realized, this is dumb. Why should I stand behind the altar when I can just as easily push it up against the wall? And then you'll all understand whether something is, what are the two phrases? Sacramental or sacrificial. Sacramental is the things that I do for you and with you, so I'm facing you. Sacrificial is when I face the altar, because that's for God. And even today's service, there were times where I was turned towards the altar, and there were times where I was turned towards the congregation. Does that matter in terms of doctrine? No, it doesn't. Plenty of churches have their altars out front and the pastor goes behind. I assume they're shorter altars, so taller pastors. Regardless, there are different ways of doing it, and that's adiaphora. Can you think of any others before I move on?
About the flags, I know there's a church that, at least one that doesn't have the flags.
Yeah. And I don't even know that they think that's adiaphora. I do, but they don't. List the question so everybody else knows what you're talking about.
Here's the question.
I mean, like, what was your point when you said flags?
Oh, I'm sorry, the flags up in front of the altar, there's the American flag and the Christian flag.
Yeah. And the pastors that you're talking about who don't think that's adiaphora, where would they put those flags?
They're gone.
Yeah, they're not in the sanctuary. So, but again, I would say that's adiaphora. It's up to the congregation where they want to put their flags. But others would say absolutely not. So. Okay, number 4, what was the use of the German, why was the use of the German language so important in the early days of the LCMS? That's
They
easy.
didn't speak English.
Yeah, they were German immigrants. They didn't speak English, so hearing the gospel in their own language was important. How did this change?
There's a word to that, in that too, because if they just spoke, because they spoke the German language, that would give them a certain amount of togetherness. They would tend to gather and listen to each other and support each other. And it would also tend to keep people who did, and since they came as a group that believed similar things, it would tend to keep their being infiltrated by other ideas, because people couldn't isolate them, so that allowing the church and the doctrine to grow.
I read a story or a book about the atrocities committed against Native Americans, and one of the issues was a lot of the settlers in Minnesota in the 1840s and 50s, and maybe before that, spoke only German. The Native Americans have been taught, besides their own languages, in English. So sometimes when there was conflict, it was because they just didn't understand each other. So there were a number of German settlers who were massacred by Native Americans. And in some cases, it had nothing to do with anything other than they couldn't understand each other, so they killed them. Now, there were English speakers who were able to talk with these Native Americans and say, whatever. And they were spared, but a lot of the Germans were not because of the language issues. There was another aspect of this, and the first settlers came over from Saxony, and some came from Prussia. But then later on in the 19th century, they weren't coming over from one particular area. They were just coming over in general. Not because they wanted religious freedom. Why did they come to America in the 1860s and 70s? Economics, yeah. America was a booming economic land, and they wanted to come and be part of that. So that was another reason why the Germans came. How did this change? I'm not sure what the question's asking, but maybe you have. Why?
Well, as more and more English people came, then we tended to learn to communicate, and then we had to set up the English, what do you call it? Group, the non-geographical English.
Oh, yeah. Yep, that's coming up actually in one of the questions.
Well, that's part of the change.
War,
More people spoke English, we needed
Keep
to
them unified.
meet their needs.
Okay, what did you say, Steve? What's that?
The war changed the language.
That's coming up too, so
Okay.
I was hesitant to get too far ahead.
Wouldn't it unify people if they had one central language that everybody could understand?
Yeah. I don't want you to know about culture, and I don't want to get too political, but language is part of culture. You share a language, and you share a culture. In Minnesota, there are a variety of different cultures, and does our state require them to assimilate? Well, should, doesn't. We were in St. Cloud yesterday, and we saw a number of Somalis. If you go to Wilmer, you see more Somalis. Yeah, I don't even know if where they're from. I mean, Somalia, obviously, but I don't know if there are other Muslims there or not. But are they expected to assimilate, or can they just practice their own stuff?
Their own, I think.
They kind of do their own thing. They're not the only ones either. Hispanic people that come here, are they forced to assimilate? No. Trace?
This is probably political, but even when your mom was working at Rosemont, they made so many exceptions.
Yeah.
With their stuff.
Yeah. And on the one hand, you want to reach as many people as possible, but I think you're talking about what they did for the workers.
Yes, yeah.
And they had Asians, I'll just leave it at that, a number of different Asians that were working there. My mom worked for an electronic company. They built, among other things, parts for airplanes. Anyway, so that's what she's talking about. Number 5, how did Walther view the role of the congregation in the synod? Let me ask it this way. Is a synod a number of different congregations and work its way up to leaders? Or does it start with, how do I say this? Is it top down or is it bottom up?
Bottom up.
Bottom up, yeah, that makes more sense than what I was trying to say. Yeah, so it's like an inverted pyramid. The people at the top of the pyramid, where it's the widest, are the congregations, are the churches. Now, do we meet at conventions as a synod? Yes. But who makes all the decisions? The congregations do. Yeah, each congregation or each circuit, I guess, elects someone to represent that circuit. There's a pastor who represents that circuit. Some circuits can send other people there as well. They're not voting members, but they can go and be part of the process. They can get up and talk. They can't vote, but they can talk. So the idea is behind the synod that all of the congregations have the authority. Now, let's put it this way, if more than 50% of our synod wanted to, let's say, have women pastors, could the synod do that? What do you think?
I would
If
say,
more than 50% of the congregations wanted women pastors, could they do it?
I would say no.
Tracy says no. Rose said no. Mary? Or was it Hazel?
I'm thinking that's a doctrinal issue, but are we allowed to vote on doctrinal at all?
What do you think? Are we allowed to vote on doctrinal
You're
matters?
saying women couldn't vote for a while, now we vote.
No.
But the Bible actually says that women can't be pastors.
No. So, if 51% of the synod said we want women pastors, what would happen? It wouldn't happen, what'd you say?
You'd be out of the Senate.
Yeah, they'd be kicked out of the Synod, because it is a doctrinal matter. Regardless of what some other denominations might think, we think that's a doctrinal matter. That's one of those things that you can't compromise on. So if 51% of the Synod wanted women pastors, guess what? 51% of the Synod would be kicked out. I don't know how that would work, and I'm glad that it's not that way, but has anyone been to convention? Gary? Randy, sorry, Randy.
I think Gary has, but I haven't.
Okay, so Gary has been there, I've been there. Do you ever think that there's somebody there who wants women's ordination?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, every convention, it's like every 3 years, I think, there's always a small group of people. I think they're known by their Hawaiian shirts, but I'm not positive about that. But it's their way of showing everybody else that they're different. And they push for women to be, more accepted in different leadership roles in a congregation. How about presidents of a congregation? Can that be a woman? Not an elder, the president.
No.
Is that a doctrinal matter? Did it say anywhere in the Constitution of the Synod that women can't be presidents of a congregation?
I don't think it actually says it, but it's thought of, that it's no woman, to be the president.
Tracy, when I was serving a church in Baltimore, who was the president?
Oh, no, that was the treasurer.
No, the president was a woman.
Oh, okay.
And did that bother me? Yeah, it did.
Really?
Sure. Because I wasn't used to having a woman president of the congregation. And I talked with her about it, and her answer was, we can't get men to do anything. And when you think back to that church, who held most of the leadership roles? Women did. And when I would do the service, I'd look out, and it was mostly women. So, she had a point. But it wasn't just because men weren't doing it. There really isn't anything in the synodical constitution that says women can't be presidents. Is there anything that says women can't be elders?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, there is. It's a biblical doctrinal thing. But as far as presidents of the congregation, nothing
That
in the,
changes everything, huh?
another in the synodical bylaws.
That changes
Now, in our church's constitution, can the president be a woman? No. No, I don't think so. Maybe Randy might know better than I do, but women can't be presidents of St. Mark's, right?
I believe the
Has to be a man.
Constitution says that they can't.
Yeah. Not every constitution says that, but ours does. So, but anyway, I thought that was a good question for you to rattle around in your brain, like, women presidents? Yeah, it can happen. I've only seen it happen once. I'm sure it's more than that, but it doesn't happen very often. Depends on the congregation, I guess. This congregation was more than happy to have a woman president, but it was troubling to me, but I accepted it because it wasn't doctrinal, it was adiaphora. So number 6, discuss these key personalities. Tell me anything you know about Johann Grauer. We've actually talked about him before. Johann A.A. Grauer. What's that?
He led the Buffalo Synod.
Yeah, I think that's right. That he was president of the Buffalo Synod, and he had discussions with Walther, and I think that was about the authority of a pastor. Does anybody know Stephanus Kale? Stephanus? There was a name that I didn't quite catch. It might have been Kale, but I'm not positive. Frederick Richmond, or Rickman. This would be it. I actually do know this one, but you guys know this one?
No, part of it was, he was the first pastor that served as a chaplain.
Yeah, in the Civil War. He was the first Missouri Synod, anyway, chaplain. And then Heinrich Christian Schwann. I don't know. And if any of you know, you're probably not going to say anything, so. Oh, I know I was in the movie. All these were in the movie, but some of them were glossed over so quickly you can't keep up.
You know that answer key?
No, not for this, I don't. I do for the other one, but not for this one. All right, number 7, why was the English Synod formed? Okay, let's just answer that first. Why was it formed?
Meet the needs of the English-speaking people.
Yeah, because there were people who came to America that spoke English. Maybe they spoke German also, maybe they didn't. Either way, they wanted the ability to worship in English. Were they at first part of the Synod?
I was just gonna ask you, why does it say English Synod as opposed to the circuit or something like that?
It's kind of a clue.
It was not attended by the Synod.
They were not part of our Synod when they first formed. That came later. What became of it? They joined the LCMS, or whatever it was called at that time. And the official publication of the English Synod, or the English District now, Lutheran Witness. Is that still the main communication tool for the Synod? Yes, it is. Yeah. So when you go out there and you see the magazine Lutheran Witness, now you know where that came from. It came from the English District, and it continues to be the main communication tool for our Synod. How did World War I impact the Synod?
What divided with the Germans, like, what does that have to do with the discrimination of the Germans?
The what?
The discrimination with the
Oh, yeah.
Germans in America, and then they're fighting the Germans and.
Right. I mean, you've got Germans in America speaking German,
Mhm.
and then you were fighting Germans over in Europe. Wouldn't it make sense that you're a little wary of your German-speaking neighbors? Yeah. After 9/11, who became a persecuted group, whether they deserved it or not? Arabs of whatever kind, yes. Because you knew they were the ones who blew up the towers, and so now every time you see an Arab on a flight with you, you wonder. I didn't fly during that time, but I'm guessing if anybody did, they kind of felt that way a little bit. So that's one of the ways World War I impacted the Synod. What else? What about the pastor in Iowa that was in jail for 10 days? What did he say that upset the local authorities?
Something in German.
Yeah, what did he say in German?
Kaiser.
Kaiser. Who were we fighting in World War I? The Kaiser. And so when the I think it was a sheriff or whatever, he heard this guy preaching in German and said the word Kaiser, that was enough. And he was in jail for 10 days until they finally figured out. It means Caesar. It doesn't mean, the leader of Germany. 10 days in jail. I'm guessing it wasn't as nice as the one across the street here. And then finally,
I would expect that would have led to more extended use of the English language in the German church too.
yes, that
In
led
order to
to,
avoid those kinds of misunderstandings
yeah,
and to avoid discrimination kind of things.
Yeah.
If we speak English, it would be better.
that's it. That was the last one I was thinking of, is it led to the Synod using English more and more. And are there still some Germans that are in the LCMS and they still speak German? Probably. Wilbert, I think, can still speak some German, but he's in his mid-90s. Yes. I actually would never mind. You don't need to know that.
Melody Royce's mom speaks.
What's that?
Melody Royce's mom.
Well, she
Oh, well, yeah, but she came here in the 60s or something. But yeah, she does speak German. You're right. Do you guys have anyone in your families that still can speak German?
My mom.
Not unless they studied it in college.
Your mom can, a little, or still a lot? A little bit? Hazel?
I said not unless you studied it in college or something like that, or in school.
My grandparents, I don't think could speak German. But my great-grandparents probably could.
Mine could, because they taught me how to sing a Christmas tree in German when I was in grade school.
Really?
Well, my grandma came over from Germany when she was just a baby, but siblings always talked about getting confirmed in German. How much they knew, I don't know, but
Yeah.
they're all gone now, but.
You know, it's interesting you say that. Where I used to serve in Nebraska, they had a records book of all the things that happened in the church, and it went back into the 1800s. Guess what it was written in? German. I had to look up these words all the time because I didn't know what it said.
I had his father's baptism and confirmation certificates. He had them framed in the, I had them on my walls for a while. They're in here.
Trace?
Remember those two sisters from my congregation, or my old congregation?
Sarah and Sylvia?
Yep, they spoke German and they did when I was young, the Christmas program, we had to learn Silent Night in German. I could still,
How many can remember one of our members singing Silent Night in German?
Wilbur.
Wilbert, yeah.
Yeah.
He told me he could sing it in German. I said, I'll get you the
Both of my parents.
lyrics or
My
whatever.
mom could too.
Al's mom could?
She always sang.
Well, both of my parents, when I was a kid, once in a while would speak German, both of them could. But I remember going, back in them days, everybody got together for cousins' birthdays and there was a big crowd and every once in a while. But when the women would get lunch together, they would, because they could all talk German back in them days, you know, because they grew up speaking German.
Yeah.
Well, when we had Christmas Eve too, she'd be singing Silent Night in German. We would get lost. She'd be beside us.
What is Silent Night? I think it's
Stille Nacht.
Stille Nacht?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. When I was a kid, our congregation would sing Silent Night in German. I didn't know any of the words. I was a kid. But I remember it because I just remember thinking this is weird and my parents would explain what was going on. Anyway, we have a German heritage. I don't even know if everybody here is German or not, but that's our heritage, is we came from Germany.
Aren't the German words printed in our hymnal for Silent Night?
Probably for that one, yeah.
I think they are.
I think so. I don't have a hymnal in front of me. There's some over there, but I can look it up after this if we have time.
Maybe a job for the choir.
There you go. Why to sing
We
that?
have to do it.
All right, number 9.
They might volunteer you to make sure pronunciation is
I
correct.
wouldn't have a clue.
The video discusses the Americanization of the Synod. What American and German influences do you see in your congregation today? Do we have any? Can you think of any?
Well, we speak English now.
Yeah. And this is a relatively new congregation, right? Emma?
Wasn't there a German that was the one that first started doing Christmas trees at Christmas time?
In our congregation?
No, like in the video.
Oh.
Video.
Yeah.
He was German.
Yeah.
That did Christmas, I don't know if
He brought the joy of Christmas trees to America.
Yeah.
They said so.
Yeah.
Well, just our names, a lot of our names.
Well, the congregation, one of the congregations I served in Nebraska, on the outside of the church, said the name of the church in German, it was Emmanuel Lutheran, and then it said UAC. Anybody know what UAC stands for? Unaltered Augsburg Confession. Yeah, and that was, when I was down there, I made a big deal of that because I don't know if this was covered in the video or will be covered in the video, but there's actually 2 Augsburg Confessions. There's the original from, I don't know, 1530 or so, that was presented to the emperor and all of that. And then about 50 years later, after Luther had died, I think it was Philip Melanchthon who said, you know what, let's change this a little bit so that more people can confess it. And it became much less confessional. And so, this church in Nebraska said, we are a church of the unaltered Augsburg Confession. We want people to know that we are with the original. I'm guessing most, I don't know all, but most LCMS churches are, but this one said we want people to know it, so they put it on the outside of the building. And then yesterday, we were in Alexandria, in an ELCA church. Remember what I nudged you?
yeah.
I pointed at the wall and it had Psalm, is it 78? maybe, it doesn't matter what song it was, in German on the wall. You remember what I said?
This used to be an LCMS church.
This probably used to be an LCMS church, because the ELCA doesn't really care about
German.
German. Yeah, Missouri Synod did, so I'm guessing, it's a pretty big church, by the way, I'm guessing way back when it used to be Missouri Synod, and then for whatever reason they left the Synod. But they kept the wall, they kept the painting, it was an old painting on the wall, and the language above it was German, so. Anyway, there are still German influences in churches today. Are there any other ethnic influences in your congregation?
Norwegian.
Norwegian, you think?
I don't know, I'm Norwegian, so I'm not German at all, so.
Well, when we get into discussions as to different document issues and stuff, you do find that there are a lot of, let's see about that, but a significant number of people who have married into the church who are of more of a Norwegian background and don't understand even why we do things differently. And when it comes to how we're gonna do things, they often express the desire to do things differently. Sometimes, I imagine somewhere along the line, sometimes they've carried the day.
Quick show of hands, who's got Scandinavian in their past? At least half, maybe more. Okay, discuss CFW Walther and Frederick Winnikin as Synod presidents. Anybody got something to say about that? Question 11. Nearly 2 million Germans came to America between 1840 and 1870. Besides religious freedom, what were other possible reasons? I think we've covered that already.
Economics.
Yeah, economics is the main thing.
Just adventure might be another one.
That could be too. All right, take out the typed up one, because this has other questions in it that weren't necessarily in the, I think some of them might be the same, but some of them are different. So question 58, what were the 2 reasons the Synod was founded? Anybody remember?
Doctrinally sound.
Right, to have doctrinally sound confessional churches. That was first. Doctrinally sound confessional churches. The other?
Pastors and teachers.
I think that's probably part of the first one. But yes, you're right. It was to provide doctors and, or not, pastors and teachers. So besides serving the members in a church, what else was the Synod called to do?
Make it easier for missionaries.
Yes. It provided a source of encouragement, a base for mission work to begin there and then continue outside those walls. What does the word synod mean? I don't think this was covered in the other one, but it is here.
Walking together.
Walking together. If you've ever wondered, and maybe you have and were too afraid to ask, synod means walking together. All right, this one I think was covered a little bit. What controversial aspect of the Missouri Synod Constitution was Leah concerned about? That congregations could do what? Call their own pastors. Right, that bothered Leah. Walther defended this aspect by basically saying that the Synod was only an
Was it advisory board?
Advisory body.
Something.
Yeah, it was an advisory body. So the Synod cannot tell you who you should have as your pastor. They can tell you how to go about that process, but they can't tell you, how to do it.
Would they remove a congregation then that called a pastor that taught other?
Would who?
Would the Synod
Missouri Synod?
remove a congregation from the Synod who called a pastor that taught contrary to doctrine?
Let's save that for next week. Because there's an answer to it.
I'm sure there's an answer.
Yeah. You can write this question down.
I already have it written down,
Oh,
I think. If not, remind me next week.
Good.
Okay, question 62. Therefore, the real power of the church was located?
congregations.
But where's the power of convocation? I mean, you're all right to a certain extent, but
From the Bible.
from the Bible, God's word. I mean, overriding any other thing is God's word. But you're not wrong when you say congregations. But that's also the answer for 63. God calls pastors through congregations. The result of this controversy between Leah and Walther, what did Leah do? Yeah, he withdrew his support from the Missouri Synod. Later on, he'll do something else, but at first, he just withdrew his support. The Synod was founded by laymen, at least in part by laymen. So we owed him a lot for our foundation. But then, as often happens, doctrinal issues came up and there was disagreement on it. Question 65, this one you kind of know a little bit. The Buffalo Synod was formed by Lutherans escaping the Prussian Union and led by Johann A.A. Grabau. Question 66, what two things did Johann A.A. Grabau insist on? Kind of covered this already. Clergy supremacy, so the pastor doesn't owe anything to anybody, he's in charge. Or pastoral supremacy, whatever. And second of all, how is authority to be shared? Or not shared? According to Grabau, who had the authority of a church? The pastor. And the synod, not the congregation. So he believed in centralized authority. He wanted that power brought together, not shared. Okay, question 67. What person did these demands remind people of? Nope. Because I think, well, no, Leah was involved, but in a different way.
The guy that got,
What's that?
the guy that got escorted across the.
Right, who was that? Martin Stephan. Yes, that was still kind of raw in people's minds. That this whole idea of pastoral supremacy, that's what Stephan tried to pull. And so that made people uncomfortable. Okay, 68, due to these differences, both sides became bitter. What did Grabau do about it?
Excommunicated the whole synod.
Yeah.
Missouri
He
Synod.
thought he had the right to do it, so he did. 69, what did German Lutherans blame for the loss of their confessional doctrines? Anybody know this? Okay, it's kind of in part in the question. What did many German Lutherans blame for the loss of confessional doctrines?
Americanization?
Yeah, many people in the Synod were speaking English now. And because they were speaking English, you just didn't have the same doctrines. At least that was what they thought. Question 70, to whom was the Lutheran witness aimed? What was their target audience? English-speaking Lutherans. Question 71, the first president of the Missouri Synod? Walther. Yep, CFW Walther. Question 72, we were going to talk about the event of the early 20th century that caused many Missouri Synod Lutherans to be distrusted. What was the event? World War I, yes. And why? Because they spoke German. And then 73, what major change happened to the Missouri Synod after the end of World War I?
English speaking.
Yeah, it became an English-speaking synod. No longer, there's still plenty of German that was used, but after World War I, they began to speak in English, and a lot of the ministry was done in English. All right, we've got a couple of minutes. Does anybody have a question over anything that didn't get covered or didn't get covered well, besides Hazel and your question? Trace?
So I missed one of them in the video, but it said I think when the synod was formed, it had 2,000 churches, 700,000 members. I don't remember how many pastors.
I don't know. 1,500, I think. You
How
said
does-
1,500.
How does that compare to today? I was just curious.
Oh, I can let you know. I honestly don't know off the top of my head how many churches, how many members. But I can look it up.
Just wondering.
Any other questions? That wasn't real helpful, was I? Okay, now I'm gonna say this, please take these with you. Don't leave them on the table because you might forget them. And, well, that's the opposite of what I wanted to say. Hopefully you don't, put them in your mailboxes, how about that? Unless you want to take these home and study them, just put them in your mailboxes, then they'll be here next time. We're almost done, not quite, but we're getting there. And then after that, start thinking now what you want to talk about in the future. Because right now, we've had great attendance at 2 videos.
You know what I want?
Do I?
A nefarious Bible study if possible.
Oh, well, that's not synodical.
Jacob Gillard is teaching it at his church.
Well, I'll talk with Jacob Gillard. He's a guy that we went to college with. Good guy. Teaches down, serves down in the cities. He's a pastor. He serves down in the
He's
cities.
teaching it, I think it's,
Well, okay. All right.
You just got to see it.
All right, God bless everybody. We'll see you either in a few minutes or next week.